Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to our Sabbath morning scripture study. I'm Ross Nichols. I'm coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I get started today, I do want to say that we are preparing here in Louisiana, where I live, for the impact of a storm called Ida. So for those of you who are not from this area, we're really concerned primarily for those who are south of us, but we do expect to get some really bad weather. That usually includes for us trees and down limbs and down trees and power outages. And hey, it's one of the costs of living in God's country, as we say. So some of you may not agree with that, but please keep the people of Louisiana, the whole coastal area, actually. We don't know exactly where it's going to hit, but the models are pretty clear. It looks like it's headed for us. And even though I am a pretty good bit inland, it still looks like we're going to get some bad weather. So today, while we still have electricity, we decided to go ahead and go with the class. We have one here in the room with me, but most are at their homes preparing, as we always do for such things. And we'll see what the week holds. We'll see if we have electricity next week. By the way, just so that you know, I'm not being an alarmist, storms of this nature, the last two that we've experienced since 1992, I've been without electricity for a couple of weeks. So thank God for a little bit of Army service, because I can usually make it through with limited resources. But so anyway, thank you for your prayers. Today, we are in class 14 of our Honest to Moses series. And I've set this up today to be a little bit shorter of a class because of the concerns with the weather and a few things that need to be done in preparation for that. But I didn't want to miss this class because last week I announced it in a way. I was teaching last week's class that I titled, Who Wrote Genesis? Moses, Another, or Others? And at the end of that class, I was talking throughout the teaching about doublets and in the narrative sections of the Pentateuch, particularly with a focus on the book of Genesis, where we have two stories that are relating the same narrative, but they differ in details. Sometimes they differ in quite a bit. Sometimes it's minor, but we covered various doublets within the text of Genesis. The naming of changing Jacob's name to Israel. We talked a little bit about the creation narrative in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And we also talked about two independent stories on the flood of Noah, which have been put together by what appears to be an editor or redactor of some sort, to where we have two stories containing basically the same story, but with different details, and they're wrapped into one nicely in the beautiful and artistic book of Genesis as we have come to possess it. Now, one of the details that I brought up as I wrapped that class up for us last week was that I noted that in these differing stories, in these doublets, quite often what we see, one of the differences is that one story telling the narrative in one story will use the name Elohim, and another story within the same text will use the divine name Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh, or Yod-Heh, Wah-Heh. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. So the question becomes, why is that? Why is that? And I ended the teaching last week with basically, as some people call it, a teaser, that I put it this way: I want to take a closer look at the names for the deity. I want to take a closer look at the name for the deity. Now, one of the things that I should say to qualify that is I want to get into, over the next several classes, more detail about various names or various titles for God. And so this will be the first in a series within a series dealing with God's name. So one of the things that I said at the end of last week's class was, how is it that the name Jehovah occurs as early as Genesis chapter 2, verse 4? It's the first time that the Tetragrammaton appears, the 4 letters. It's the first time it appears in the text of the Bible. In other words, we go from Genesis 1:1 all the way to 2:3, and we only encounter Elohim. But when we get to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, we get the 4-lettered name of God. Now, how is it that appears so early in the text, Genesis 2:4, and then, by the way, 165 times in the book of Genesis, but then we read in the book of Exodus in chapter 6, it says that God says that He was not known by this name above my head that early. In other words, He says very specifically to Moses that I was not known by this name to the patriarchs. Now, either the Bible is mistaken or that's a true statement. And today I'm going to be looking at that specific question as well as a few other related questions. We're looking for answers from the text. So I do, in fulfillment of my teaser last week, I do want to spend today's class looking at this very question. This class today, like many of my classes in the recent past, many of my recent teachings, this class too is related to the quest for the historical Moses. Namely, the things that we are learning in these classes will help us to discern what was written by Moses and what was written at the time of Moses. Simply put, what was not written by Moses and not written at the time of Moses is a result of this study as well. We'll be able to discern between that which is truly dated to the time of Moses and possibly to the hand of Moses, and we'll be able to recognize very clearly through a careful study that which is not. Now, as it turns out, one of the best clues as to when a text is written has to do with names. Names are one of the clues that help us to determine the age of a text. And of particular interest, also names of people and names of God. And of particular interest in terms of names, one of the best clues is when the name of God and the name of people meet. So one of the best clues is where a person's name and God's name come together. That's going to give us some definite time frame to place a text in, because it's where the human and the divine meet in a name that one can learn the most. We can learn the most about the time of a text, especially when we overlay certain historical data, certain historically known details. We can look at these names and say, aha, I know when that was written and I know when it was not written. So, part of my class today deals with names for God and what those names can teach us about the dating of a text and other things as well. In other words, we're going to be looking at these details and discerning much from what some people might think is little. But we're also going to be looking at a second point in today's class, different but related, and it deals with the names of people in the Bible and what those names can teach us about the dating of a text and other things. So if you caught that, We're looking at names of God and what that can teach us about the dating of a text. And we're looking at the names of people and what that can teach us about the dating of a text. So I begin today with a problem. I begin today with a problem posed or presented to us within the biblical text, and that's plural, text. Within the biblical text, there is a problem, and it has to do with the name of God. Now, behind me, over my head, you will see 4 Hebrew letters, and from this side, we're working this way. I had to get that right on the screen. So we have Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. We're going to talk about that. For many of us, I should say, the name of God, discovering that God had a name. Now, don't get too hung up on the way I'm saying this yet, because I'm going to unpack it for us. But when most of us learned that our English Bibles would say Lord, L-O-R-D, and we realized that behind that was a word that didn't mean Lord, that Lord was a substitution for this name, it changed everything. It was and is and remains to be a vital part of our faith. In fact, many of us know that movements and ministries have been founded and sustained on this. To know God's name is very important. It's very important. If you read through, anyone who studied the Bible, and I know that I'm talking to a biblically literate group here, you know of all the texts which speak about knowing God's name. It becomes a central part of the faith. To know God's name, and perhaps even more importantly, particularly among these groups, these ministries and movements that focus on the name particularly, how to properly pronounce the name becomes an essential part of the faith. And I want to say, I think that these people are all very well intentioned, but you know who I'm talking about. A lot of people have built entire ministries on what was God's name, what was the proper pronunciation, and some of these, even well-intentioned though they might be, will basically say that if you don't say the name right, or if you're not pronouncing it right, God doesn't even hear you. You know, I mean, you have to get this right, as James Tabor calls it. It's like a mantra. It's, it's something that people often, if I've got it right, I all the time I'm saying it and so forth. Now, disagreements on the name abound. People have fought over this, the pronunciation, and whether one should even pronounce it. The Orthodox, the Jewish community, has chosen not to pronounce the name. And when this name is encountered in the text, people will substitute Adonai for the name so that they don't pronounce it, because to them it's too holy to pronounce. But what these groups find in their study of the Bible, and I've been in this myself, is that when you read it, you know that the biblical people, such as Moses and David and men and women in the biblical period, they knew nothing of this rule. The name was spoken freely. In fact, in Deuteronomy, in 2 places, we're told that we are to swear by the name. So it was commonly used in speech. In the ancient world, it's not likely that they walked around and substituted the name for Adonai, nor did they say Hashem in speech. The name was used. But again, the question is, how is it pronounced? Now, the question becomes, is it even recoverable? Can we determine how to recover the proper pronunciation? And I know most people who are listening to me are saying yes, and it is, and you have your particular pronunciation. So what we're dealing with is, how do you pronounce these 4 Hebrew letters over my head? And by the way, my class today is not just about how do you pronounce God's name? It's actually about a related topic, a topic related to the study of the name, and I will get into my understanding of the pronunciation. But these 4 letters are known in many sources, particularly in the academic world, as the Tetragrammaton, which is a Greek word which means 4 letters. And as you can see, there are in fact 4 letters. This particular four-lettered word occurs in the text of the Hebrew Bible more than 6,000 times, in various estimates from 6,000 to 6,800. I think some get it down to a very specific 6,876. However many it is, it occurs thousands of times. The question again is, how is it pronounced? Some people say Yahweh. Some people say Yehovah, emphasized exactly like that. Some people say Yehovah. Some say Yahuwah. I mean, look, if you get on Facebook, which Facebook is authoritative, as many of you know, you'll find the greatest linguistic experts of all time, and they'll tell you why their pronunciation is correct, and it's the only correct one. And they range from the examples I've given to many, many more. Some of them I can hardly even read. There are a host of possibilities, but all of these possibilities are derived from an attempt to vocalize these 4 Hebrew letters. Now, I opened and I made the statement as I worked through them, and I said the letters are, in Hebrew, Yod-He, Vav-He. But the first problem shows up when I say that. Because people say, well, is the 3rd letter, this letter, is this a Vav or a Wah? So here we go. Here comes the disagreements. And people argue over this. In fact, if you get most any Hebrew grammar today and you want to study biblical grammar, biblical Hebrew, in the alphabet chart, usually at the front of the book, it's going to show you Wah, comma, Vav. And then when it gives the approximation in English for that, in an English letter, it will say W, comma, V. Well, which one is it? This makes a difference, right? If we're trying to figure out the name of God, we need to figure out what the letters are. I mean, before you can read something, you have to know the phonetic value, at least an approximation, before you can even get close. Now, the academic world, most scholars, if you read academic papers, they will use Yahweh when they see this, and they give examples as to why that is. You can find there is untold amount of literature out there on the divine name. In fact, back in the 80s, when I was beginning to study, this is one of the first things that I was passionate about. And I was hard on people about this. It's Yahweh, and if you can't see that, you clearly have not studied Scripture. And that was my stand, and there was no one, I mean no one, who could beat me away from that solution. Many scholars have settled on Yahweh as the correct pronunciation. And so what you'll also find quite frequently in material, primarily academic material, you'll find the name represented, not spelled out as Yahweh, but you'll sometimes see it as YHWH or sometimes YHVH. Those English approximations are meant to represent the divine name in English without weighing into the debate as to how you pronounce it. In some ways, this is a good way to do it, but even there, again, you're going to get disagreements. Now, most know this, but if you want to know, and I think, like I said, most of you probably are already aware of this, but the way that people come up with the pronunciation Yahweh is based, at least in part, on a quote from Josephus. And I wanted to read this. I wanted you to have this in your notes. I know I said this is not a class on the pronunciation of the name, and here I'm going with a class on the pronunciation of the name, but it's really just an introduction. So this comes from The Wars of the Jews, The Wars of the Jews, and it is in Book 5, Chapter 5. And it says, now this is the conversation, what Flavius Josephus, the first century historian, what he is recounting here is a description of the high priest, particularly what the high priest, his garments look like. And here's what it says: a mitre, like a headband, also of fine linen encompassed his head, which was tied by a blue ribbon, about which there was another golden crown, in which was engraven the sacred name, meaning the name of God. And it consists of 4 vowels. 4 vowels. Okay. Well, that's interesting, because if you open your grammar book and you're a beginning student of biblical Hebrew, one of the first things you're going to read is that the Hebrew language consists of 22 characters, all of which, this is almost word for word, you'll find it in every grammar book, all of which are consonants. So what is Josephus talking about? Are there vowels? And what we know is that over time, particularly when we're dealing with Semitic languages, we have what grammarians call, they use a Latin phrase, and it's mater, all right? And it means mother. And so sometimes you'll see matris lectionis, which is mothers of reading. They realize that over time, in order to articulate, in order to pronounce certain words within a language, some letters took on vocalic power in the sense of a vowel sound. Some letters began to serve double duty. We have examples of this in English. You know that the letter Y in English can function both as a consonant and a vowel. Think about the word yellow. Think about the word Kelly, or the name Kelly, where Y represents a vowel sound. So the Hebrew and other Semitic languages also contain these particular letters. Now, the point is that when people, the way that they come up with Yahweh is that they pronounce these as vowels. So you have here E, this is the way they come up with this, E-A-U-A. E-A-U-A. 4 vowels. Now, if you say it faster, E-A-U-A, E-A-U-A, that's how you come up with, or how they come up with the pronunciation Yahweh. But I want you to notice that even though you pick up the consonant sounds, yeah, it's not technically Yah, if this is proper. It's really Yah, Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. So it's, and somebody says, well, that's subtle. I think it is subtle, and I think that this is closer to what we're getting at when we talk about the name and how it's pronounced. You're dealing with vowel sounds that are brought together. Now, in English, you'll see this in names, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but the yod-hey, when it occurs on a word in English in what we call transliteration, you know the difference in translation and transliteration. Transliteration is taking a word or a phrase and bringing it into another language using the characters of the recipient language, but you're preserving the Hebrew word. So when you find at the end of a word in English, IAH, particularly among names like Isaiah. You know, we say it Isaiah, but it's actually trying to represent in Hebrew Isaiah, and that's not even Hebrew fully. We'll get more as we go. But this pronunciation, Yahweh, this becomes problematic when we look at the second part of my teaching today and the real part of my class. In other words, we're going to show forth evidence as to how the name was pronounced in antiquity during the biblical period, as it's expressed and as it's presented and as it's preserved within the names of people of the biblical times. It's a clue. We're going to be looking at some of these names and really focusing in on how is it that the name is preserved within names. And that's going to help us with the pronunciation. Now, you have a vocabulary word of the day. Here's your vocabulary word of the day. Some of you may know this. Raise your hand if you know this word already. It's theophoric or theophory or theophory. Pronunciation might be a little bit different. I've listened to it several times. It's also built on a Greek word. Theophory is a Greek word that means bearing a god. Theo in Greek means God. Theophory is bearing a god, and theophoric names deal with a name which bears forth the name of a god. Now, some definitions will tell you that this means derived from or bearing the name of God. That's close enough. The idea is that within a name, God's name is there. So this has been around forever. It's been around forever, at least it seems so. It's evidenced in many ancient cultures, not just biblical, not just Hebrew, but in many cultures in the ancient world, we find the subject of names bearing the name of God. Now, if you recall back earlier in our Honest to Moses series, I talked about the name of Moses. The name of Moses is a good example to build from. So I brought this up weeks and weeks ago, and I didn't quite have everything mapped out as far as we are today, but I knew that I would be able to come back to it. So Moses is a word. It has nothing to do with God or gods. But in Egyptian, Mosa or Moses means born of, like birthing, born. So for instance, you have the names, some popular Egyptian names that you'll know, Tutmosa. Tutmosa. You know what Tutmosa means? Born of Tut. So it's an indicator that this person who bears the name is born of the god Tut. And what about Ramesses? Ramesses. You hear the Messes on the end. Ramesses is born of. Ra means Ra, the god Ra. So we have this idea that Ramesses, the ruler Ramesses, is staying in his name. He's bearing the name Ra. He's born of Ra. And these are just a few examples of names which bear the name of God. And the Bible is full of these. Many, many examples. I spent all of yesterday, I had built up to this in my studies, and I spent all day studying this particular subject. And one of the papers that I read, one of the academic papers, was by Dana M. Pike, who their doctoral thesis was published in 1990, and the study is called Israelite theophoric names in the Bible and their implications for religious history. Now, doesn't that sound like exciting reading? It actually was pretty good. Now, here's some of the things that I learned in that particular study and offshoots of that study, because as I read that study, I ended up pulling other studies forward and reading those as well. So here's what we know. There are 521 biblical individuals who bear theophoric names. Theophoric names, 521 biblical individuals. We also have, and this I read in another major study by Jeffrey Tegay, the great Bible scholar, particularly in terms of Deuteronomy history, but I read Jeffrey Tegay had written a paper on this subject. There are 1,200 names from the biblical period, I'm talking from the Hebrew Bible period, 1,200 names on inscriptions, lapidary examples, and 671 names contain these elements of God's name being born within a name. This is a common practice in the ancient world. And by the way, it's still around. We still use names which bear the name of God. And most of these are biblical names. I have 6 kids. 2 of my sons have what you would call theophoric names. I have Zechariah. I have Tobias, which is sort of a Greek form of Toviah. So these names are even used today. Now, I did want to bring in, because I keep thinking about it, when my oldest son, who's now 33, when he was a boy, 5, 6, 7, 8, playing baseball, I remember, and those of you who know me, I bring my Bible with me everywhere I go. And so at a ballpark, you know, I might flip through my Bible. I'm very good about when my child or grandchild is up to bat, I watch, you know, I pay attention. But a lot of times I use the time to study or to, you know, take notes or whatever. And I remember at one game, I hear a mother hollering from the stands, Yahweh. Well, that caught my attention. Yahweh. The child's name was Yahweh. Now, that's pretty bold. Most parents don't go that far. Most of these names have an element of the divine name, but this child's name was spelled Jahway, which I thought was pretty clever. Yahweh. And this, I'm telling you, first of all, let me tell you about Yahweh. That was a good ball player, fastest kid I've ever seen in my life, as you would expect from a child named Yahweh. But I remember here was a mother who probably was very biblically oriented, and some might say, it's a little bit, I don't know that I would do that. That's a little bit bold, and you shouldn't do that. But the important point that I'm trying to make is, this is, people want the name of God in their child's name. Now, most theophoric names combine the name of a deity with a word. They don't just call the child's name after the God's name and that's it. So, for instance, we have examples such as Eleazar. Eleazar, you have the Hebrew El or Eli, and then Ezer, which means help. So it could mean El is my help, or El is my helper, something of that nature. What about the biblical name Shmuel? Shema, you hear Shema in there? The Hebrew Shema means to listen or take heed, and then El. So does the name mean God hears? El hears? And then you have, look, let me give you an example from the text. Go with me to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis 16 and verse 11, 16:11. show you how this works. Genesis 16:11, the angel of the Lord said to her further, this is Hagar, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call him Ishmael. Ishmael, for the Lord has paid heed to your suffering. So basically it's saying, and by the way, this brings up another problem, but let's just go with it like it says. It says, you shall call his name Ishmael because Jehovah has paid heed or listened to your suffering. A more accurate way to put that is you shall call him Ishmael, for El has paid heed, right? Because if you wanted to make that match perfectly, you would either call his name Yehoel or, to get the divine name in. So really, Ishmael is called Ishmael because El heard your suffering. Of the names within the biblical text that employ a form of a divine element in them, and it's the Tetragrammaton that's used. Now, in various forms, this occurs depending on whether the element is at the beginning of the word or at the end of the word. In other words, it's going to vary. If it's at the beginning of the word, the divine element, and then another word, then it's going to be pronounced one way. If it occurs at the end of the word, the divine element, then it's going to be pronounced another way. Now, scholars call this, whenever the name, the four-lettered name of God in one form or another appears in a theophoric name, what they call these are Yahwistic names. Remember, scholars say that this name is pronounced Yahweh. So this is apparent even in English. Okay, when you look at the English text, you'll be able to see this. I'm using English. Isaiah. You hear the Yah on the end? Isaiah. Isaiah. Remember, it's not technically and strictly consonantal. So I'm not pronouncing the Y. The Y is formed by the combination of two syllables, Yah, Yah, Yah. Subtle, but I hope you get this. What about Jeremiah? Again, English. Obadiah, Nehemiah, Uzziah. Eliyahu is a little bit different, but you hear the Yahu on the end is part of a divine, an element of the divine name. Even in modern times, and this is a biblical name as well, but most of us are familiar with Benjamin Netanyahu. You hear Netanyahu? A gift of Yahoo? That's what the name means. So names have meaning, and they have, at times, they bear the name of God. You can think of many, many more that include Yah, or perhaps, again, more strictly, Yah, 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 because it's vowel sounds. Get this, vowel sounds, not consonants. The interesting thing, though, and I find this to be very interesting, is that while Yah and Yahu are often found in these names, it only occurs in this pronunciation at the end. Okay? So if you, for instance, let me make this clear, when Yod-Hey or Yod-Hey Vav occur in a name, it's pronounced Yah or Yahu at the end of a word. Not one example that I know of where that pronunciation occurs at the beginning. So when Yod and Hey, or Yod, Hey, and Vav, or Wah, as the case might be, appear within a name, It is not, if it occurs at the beginning, it is not, underline, 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 pronounced Yah or Yahu. We do have, however, we do find this theophoric element occur in many, many names in the biblical text. And we find pronunciation or Now it's kind of hard in English. I'm trying to stress the point about the vowel sounds. So if we look at, now remember in the biblical text, you're also going to find that over time, this letter, which is sometimes, by the way, all these are generally represented as consonants, but this is generally, sometimes you'll see YHVH or YHWH, but you also find that over time, the yod, as it developed through language over and over, ultimately there was a development in roughly the 16th century of the letter J in English. And so that's where you sometimes see JHVH or JHWH. And you know, people, I say Jehovah, and people say, well, Ross doesn't know that there wasn't a J in ancient Hebrew. Ross does know that, I assure you. Ross also knows that there was not an H or a V or a W in the ancient Semitic languages. We're dealing with the development of language. We're speaking English. So, for instance, I also don't read and I say, open your Bibles to Yirmiyahu. Some of you would know that that's Jeremiah, but, you know, I mean, how much Hebrew do you want in a class? Do we say Yerushalayim? You know, in other words, we have English language, but that's part of the point. But when we find the divine elements at the beginning of the word in a Yahwistic name, to use the scholarly definition or the scholarly title, you find Yehoachaz, you hear this? Yehoachaz, Yehoash, Yehozavad, Yehochanan, Yehoyada, Yehoyachin, Yehoyacham, Yehoyanadab, Yehoshaphat. I'm using Y to get back closer just since I just covered that. But these would be in English. Jehoachaz, Jehoash, Jehozavad, Jehoshaphat. But notice none of these names are Yahu, Yahuchaz, or Yahuash, or Yaash. Not a single example of which I am aware that the pronunciation Yah or Yahu occurs at the beginning. Now, we notice a few other things when it comes to theophoric names that bear on our present study, our present quest. At times we find these names with a prefixed theophoric element that's been reduced from Yeho to Yo. So instead of having Yod He Vav in the name in Hebrew, you just have Yod and Vav. But people refer to this as a theophoric name, but it's a different form. So sometimes when you see Yo, and what's interesting is that in the biblical text, you'll sometimes see a name such as Yehoash is spelled Yoash. Now, why is that? Why is that difference there? It's same guy, same person. But at times you see Yehoash, Yehoiakim, you know, these spellings, and then at other times the He is eliminated. As some scholars propose that there was a scribal practice that resulted in, and it's being driven by theological points. So you don't want, at a later period, this is what some scholars have proposed, that at a later period, when the pronunciation of the divine name became taboo, you would rather call someone who was known as Yehoash. That gets too close to the divine name, which is now forbidden, so it's truncated. It's reduced, if you will, to Yoash. But that editing process was not full. It wasn't complete. And so the theological, if this is true, this is right, this is a theory, it wasn't complete. It wasn't thorough to wash the text of all of this that we see. Now, we also find within the text of the Bible, not only do we find names that are spelled differently and so forth, and text which employ different forms of the name, but we see almost two traditions, which I brought up a little bit last week in our study of Genesis, where a text will sometimes report an account and use the name, the Tetragrammaton, and at other times the same story is told in a different place and it uses Elohim. Question is, which one is first? Was the text originally written with Yehovah, and then someone said, no, we have to take that down to Elohim because we don't pronounce the name? Or was it the other way around? Was it originally Elohim, and later when the name became spoken, was the name placed where it once said Elohim? Let me give you an example. That's best. Go with me to 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel 5. And let me read verse 19. 2 Samuel 5:19. David inquired of Jehovah, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands? And Jehovah answered David, go up and I will deliver the Philistines into your hands. Okay, Jehovah. See that? Now go down to verse 23. Look at verse 20. Thereupon David marched to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there, and he said, Jehovah has broken through my enemies before me as waters break through a dam. Now look at verse 23. David inquired of Jehovah, and he answered, do not go up, but circle around behind them and confront them at the Baka trees. And when you hear the sound of marching of the tops of the Baka trees, then go into action, for Jehovah will be going in front of you to attack the Philistine forces. And David did as Jehovah had commanded him, and he routed the Philistines from Gevah all the way to Gezer. Jehovah. David inquired of Jehovah, Jehovah, are they going to deliver me? Jehovah said yes. Jehovah did this, Jehovah did that. David inquired of Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah. Hold your hand here and go to 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles chapter 14. The question will be, what's going on here? Chapter 14, verse 10, 1 Chronicles. David inquired of God, shall I go against the Philistines? By the way, that says Elohim. David inquired of Elohim, will you deliver them up into my hands? And Yehovah, notice it's got this one in here, answered him, go up and I will deliver them into your hands. Thereupon David ascended Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. David said, Elohim burst out against my enemies by my hands as waters burst out. Same story. You see that? The only difference is that the text in Chronicles has almost completely been changed, or is it Samuel that's been changed? But here, now look down at verse 13. Verse 14, David inquired of Elohim once more, and Elohim answered him, don't go up after them, but circle around them and confront them at the Baka trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the Baka trees, then go out to battle for Elohim will be going out in front of you to attack the Philistines. Verse 16, David did as Elohim commanded him, and they routed the Philistines. You see, this is the same story. In one text, the deity is referred to as Yehovah. In another text, the deity is referred to as Elohim. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 6. Here's a story that you remember probably more details about. 2 Samuel 6, verse 9. Now remember, this occurs right after Uzzah is killed for touching the ark. Look at verse 9, 2 Samuel 6, 9. David was afraid of Jehovah that day. And he said, how can I let the ark of Jehovah come to me? Look down at verse 11. The ark of Jehovah remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and Jehovah blessed Obed-Edom and his whole household. Look down at verse 17. They brought the ark of Jehovah and set it up in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it, and David sacrificed burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before Jehovah. Go to 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 13. 1 Chronicles 13, same story. And it says, verse 12, David was afraid of God that day. It doesn't say Jehovah here. He said, how can I bring the ark of God here? David didn't remove the ark. Look down at verse 14. The ark of God remained in the house of Obed-Edom in its own abode 3 months, and the Lord, interesting, blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. Look down at chapter 16, 1 Chronicles 16, verse 1. And they brought in the ark of God and set it up inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and they sacrificed burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before God. So what we have is different literary traditions which are preserved. Details are fairly consistent, but in one version, you have the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Tetragrammaton, and in another text reporting the same event, the name Elohim. Now, one more example. Look at Psalm 14. Psalm 14. And let's look at verse 2. Psalm 14, verse 2. The Lord, Jehovah looks down from heaven on mankind to find a man of understanding, a man mindful of God. Look at verse 4. Are they so witless, all these evildoers who devour my people as they devour food and do not invoke Jehovah? Look at verse 7. Oh, that the deliverance of Israel might come from Zion when Jehovah restores the fortunes of his people. Jacob will exult, Israel will rejoice. Look at Psalm 53. Psalm 53. Same psalm, by the way, basically. 53 and verse 3. God looks down from heaven on mankind to find a man of understanding, a man mindful of God. Look at verse 5. Are they so witless, those evildoers who devour my people as they devour food and do not invoke God? Verse 7. Oh, that the deliverance of Israel might come from Zion when God restores the fortunes of his people. You see, Psalm 14 uses the divine Tetragrammaton. Psalm 53 uses Elohim. Now, why is that? The question is, why do these differences exist? Now consider this. go to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, verse 26. And to Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he named him Enosh. It was then, that's a long time ago, it was then that men began to call upon the name of Jehovah. When? All the way back. That's what it says in Genesis 4:26. And by the way, remember Genesis 2:4 is the first mention of the divine name. And it occurs, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, this Tetragrammaton occurs in Genesis some 160 some odd times. Now go with me to Exodus chapter 6. Exodus chapter 6. And verse 2. And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Jehovah. I am Jehovah. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. But by my name, Jehovah, I was not known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. I've now heard the moaning of the Israelites because of the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelite people, Ani Yehovah, I am Jehovah. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you out from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. He says, I am Jehovah. By my name, Jehovah, I was not known to the patriarchs. Now look at Exodus 3. Exodus 3, I want to read from verse 13. Moses said to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. He continued, thus you shall say to the Israelites, Ehyeh, Ehyeh sent me to you. And God said further to Moses, thus you shall speak to the Israelites, Jehovah, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, this my appellation for all eternity. And then he says, go and assemble the elders of Israel and say, Jehovah, the God of the fathers of your fathers, and so forth, has appeared to me. Now here's a question for you. Moses rightly has this question of God. He just met God at the burning bush. God has introduced himself by this new name. He said, I wasn't known by this name to the children of Israel. I was known as El Shaddai. So the children of Israel are back in Egypt. And God is talking to Moses at Horeb. And Moses says, when I tell them you sent me, you're the God of their fathers, they're going to say, what's his name? What do I tell them? And he gives him a name that the children of Israel don't know. Let that sink in for a minute. He says, I'm Jehovah, but I wasn't known by that name. So imagine Moses going back to Egypt, and he says, hey, the God of our fathers has said that he's going to deliver us. And they said, yeah, well, what's his name, Moses? And he says, his name is Yehovah. Don't you think somebody would have said, never heard of that? This is an interesting question. Remember in the story of the Exodus, we have Pharaoh, when Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, Jehovah's met with us and he says he wants us to go out. Pharaoh says, I've never heard, I don't know Jehovah. Moses could say, he doesn't, but this is just to make the point. He said, well, we didn't know the name either. So you're not alone in this. But I'm telling you, I met with the God at the burning bush, and you better let us go. They didn't know the name prior to Exodus 6. Now the question becomes, how then do we find the name 165 times in Genesis? Now, back to my Theophoric name study. A lot of research, by the way, on this subject as I learned preparing this class. When we deal with Yahwistic names, I'm going to work backwards. Remember, we have 571 Yahwistic names, as they're called, in the biblical period. Post-exile, texts which occur in the post-exilic time, we have 108 occurrences of Yahwistic names. Late Judah to the exile, we have 119 occurrences of a form of this name in people's name. The divided monarchy, say from 931 BCE to 722 BCE, we have 108 occurrences. Judges through the monarchy, the beginning of the monarchy, 137 times a form of this name occurs in people, in the names of people. Late settlement period, like conquest of the land, late period. Get ready, we have 3. You see, it's used a lot less, like 3 times in the earliest stages, and then it jumps up to hundreds as you get into the biblical period from beyond the settlement, like the monarchy period, hundreds and hundreds of times. Now, how many names in the patriarchal period contain a form of this name in their names? How many? Everybody write your answer on a paper. 0. 0, as in none. Now think about that. We have theophoric elements in names. Ishmael, but it's El. Israel, but it's El. Think about it. The one that is chosen by the Creator is called Israel, with El in it. Now think about all the sons of Israel. Don't you think that somebody would have part of this in their name? Now some of you might be saying, wait a minute, I got one, Ross. Yehuda. Nope. Good try. The Yeh on the front of Yehuda is a verbal prefix of the imperfect. Without going into a lot of grammar, it's not a form of the divine name. So why is this? Why is it that the divine name, as we have it here, is not found in the names during the patriarchal period? It's not found until the time of Moses. Why is that? It's very simple. It wasn't known. It was not known until the time of Moses. Now, let me underscore this for you. Guess what time frame we're in when it's used for the very first time? Go with me to the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers, chapter 13. And this is, by the way, Numbers 13 is the story of the spies, so-called scouts. And in verse 8, it says, this is a list of the tribe, the men, the leaders that are being sent out. Verse 8 says, Numbers 13:8, from the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea, son of Nun. Hoshea. This is his name. What's your name, sir? Hoshea. You're Ben Nun? Hoshea ben Nun, that's me. Moses tells him, well, I got to change for that. I want to change your name. Look at verse 16. Those were the names, Numbers 13:16, those were the names of the men whom Moses sent to scout the land, but Moses changed the name of Hoshea, son of Nun, to Yehoshua. Yehoshua. Moses takes his right-hand man. Moses has just learned the divine name. And he takes his successor, who is to be his successor, and he adds a theophoric element to his name. And he says, your name will now be Yehoshua. Because now it means the salvation of Yehovah. Now some do suggest one other name in the Pentateuch. Now think about what I'm saying here. One other name in the Pentateuch which has the divine name. One. Some suggest one other name, and that's Yocheved. Yocheved. It's mentioned 2 times. Exodus chapter 6, verse 20. Numbers chapter 26, verse 59. And by the way, it's Moses' mother. Okay? It's interesting, though, to point out that the name is the reduced form, Yo. So if this is a theophoric name, if Yocheved is a theophoric name, then it is the reduced form, which many scholars believe is later. But let me ask you this. It doesn't matter to me because, again, it's another example, but it's the only other example in the Pentateuch, and it's from the time of Moses. What if Moses changes his mother's name? He changed Joshua's name from Hoshea to Yehoshua. Either way, it's from the time of Moses. Did Moses introduce this name? Did Moses introduce the children of Israel to the name Yehovah or Yehoah? Now, by the way, you see how I used I left the V out? Look, I know that there's some interesting research out there, and some have argued for the pronunciation of the V. I think, again, just to kind of underscore what I've said today, I don't think these are consonants, so to speak, in a strict sense. I think that they were probably originally pronounced more with the vowel power that is exhibited when you say, yeah. You get this, yeah, or. Now, whenever I think about the name and the evidence from the Pentateuch which suggests that it just wasn't known until Moses brings it to the children of Israel. So let me ask you, where did Moses learn the name? Where did he get it from? And what is the origin of that name? And what's the true meaning of that name? You know, we have folk F-O-L-K, F-O-L-K, folk etymology in the Bible that, quite frankly, presents names according to a Hebrew scribe trying to make it fit Hebrew, and that's really not what it means. It comes from another language source. So is it that when we read in Exodus chapter 3, the meaning of the name, is that similar to the story in Moses' naming, where Moses is roughly, if you squint, you can connect it to a Hebrew verb that means to draw out. But what if it's really Egyptian? Right? We talked about that. So what about the name? What about this four-letter name? What if it's not really Hebrew? What if we have to look somewhere else for the name? Look, did Moses, is he the first one to learn this name? According to the Bible, he is. At least among the Israelite people. Moses brings this new name, God's new name, to the people of Israel. They never heard this name before. Where did he learn it? And what are some of the other ancient names of God that the children of Israel called the deity? What does El Shaddai really mean? What does El mean? What does El Elyon? Is El a Canaanite god and thus to be shunned? Is El and Eloi and Elohim, are those just titles? How many times have I heard those are just titles, but this is a name? Is that true? You know what? We've got some questions before us that deserve our attention, and we're going to provide some answers to these and other mysteries around the name or the names of the deity. But to listen to that, you got to check us out next week. So we're going to turn our attention to the more an in-depth study of the names of God. Join me next Saturday, assuming we have electricity. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Prayers for all of you in the storm's path, including my own family members. Thank you for joining us. I love you. See you next week.